Hello, this is Sam Hanson with Discus of the Southwest. I'm bringing this video today to you to go over heaters and how I heat my tanks, and how the way I heat my tanks kept me from suffering a large catastrophic loss just the other day. In anything else I do, whether it be filtration, lighting, or heaters, I try to mitigate failure or mitigate safety concerning failure of heating a tank, or lighting a tank, or filtering a tank, by having a couple different fail safes, and I kind of go over two different ways that I do my tanks as far as having heaters set up in them, and how I heat my tanks. I've got it done two different ways. One way on my 75-gallon tank, and another way on my rack system, which I've got my rack system consists of four 30-gallon fish tanks with about a 30-gallon sump. So I have about 150 gallons there. My 75-gallon tank is 75 gallons plus about 20 gallons of water there. So I've got about 95 gallons in that. So I've got 150 gallons and 95 gallons. Now, over the years, I've used a lot of different heaters. I've used the Ebo Jagger heaters. I don't know if you remember the old heaters where the top was all green molded plastic, and then the power cable was also green. Really good heaters. I've used the Pro Heats, where you have a heating controller and then a titanium rod, because I almost always use sumps in all my filtration systems. Never had a failure with those either, but I always had just one point of failure. In other words, if my Pro Heat system went out, then I was just out of heater. Either if it got locked in the on position, or if it got locked in the off position. I've just got one component of failure. So I started looking for other ways to mitigate safety as far as failures in heaters go. If you haven't had a failure with a heater with it just quit working one day, or maybe a fish banged it real hard and it cracked and it started leaking, or if it got stuck in the on position, I think I've gone through everything in that scenario there. I've had fish break heaters. I've had them get stuck in on position, and I've had them also fail where they just quit working. Which one's the worst? Depends on the fish. In all my situations, I haven't lost any fish in any of those situations, because I figured it out pretty quick what was going on. But I was lucky. I'm in my tanks almost every day because I keep Discus. So whether you keep Discus or keep other fish, it's very important. I mean, your part of your life support system is, as far as the heaters go, is very important in almost every situation, except maybe if you're keeping goldfish or something like that, where it's very cold water fish. You've got to understand is different heaters have different ways of working. The new Ebo Jaggers, or the Eheim, is taking over making those heaters. They're usually red and blue, and without all the green on them. These heaters, I've never had a problem with them. They are a mechanical heater. There are mechanical heaters like the Jagger, and there's electronic heaters like the top fins and stuff like that. Which electronic heaters, they have a electronic temperature sensor inside of them that turns them off and on. The Eheims, or the Jagger heaters, do not. It's a mechanical heater. In other words, there's a piece of metal in there that once it heats up to a certain temperature, that metal goes from the off position to the on position, or from off to on. Let's say if you set up your heater at 95 degrees, once the water drops down to probably 2 or 3 degrees less than that, like 93 or 94, that metal will flip over, turning it on, and it'll run. And most people don't understand too, if you have it set at like 95 degrees, it's probably going to heat up beyond 95 to like 96, maybe 95 and a half, 96, maybe as high as 96 and a half or so degrees before that flips back over and turns itself off. Now, in the same way, it's not going to turn on. If you got it set at 95 degrees, it's not going to turn on at 94.9 or 94.8 or 94 and a half or anything like that. It's probably going to get at least down to 94, probably closer to 93 degrees before it turns on and flips across. You can read the manufacturer's specs on how they, what they expect the differences to be between off and on. but they may be off as well. I've kind of had to calibrate almost every heater I've ever bought. Now the EBO or the EHIMs, you can calibrate them. You got a calibration ring. You set it in a bucket of water, turn it on, put a trusted thermometer in. I can talk about thermometers in another video, but once you determine what the actual temperature is, then you can move the calibration ring on these. Another reason I kind of like these heaters, plus I've just never had them fail. Now I'm using a sump, so even though it's got a glass case on here, because it's down in my sump, fish aren't going to be banging it or bouncing around. It's another reason I use these. Now if you've got Oscars or some kind of other heavy fish that like to play with heaters, they may have fun playing around with these and bang them against the glass, so they may not be the best heater for you if you keep them in tank. Keep all of mine in I've got all sumps in all my tanks, so it works fine with me. Now, because it's a mechanical heater though, it could get stuck in the on position, which in case it could overheat your tank. A runaway heater situation. I've got two different ways of solving that. One, I've got 150 gallons in my rack system. One way I do that, I've tested it. I have only 300 watt heaters in my tank. I have tested where I've turned that 300 watt heater on as high as it'll go, leave it in that sump, and then, of course, I didn't have any fish in here. I was just testing and setting everything up. Want to see how hot it would get my tanks. After running for a solid week, constant on, it only heated my water up in my topmost tanks to right about 90 degrees, which Discus can, it's a survivable temperature as far as Discus go. So I knew if I had a 300 watt heater and it gets stuck on position, even if it runs for a solid week or 2 weeks, it's not going to overheat my tanks. Now, the only problem with that is, again, I got a mechanical heater and I would like to have a little tighter temperature control. In other words, I'd like my tank not to drop 2 or 3 degrees before my heaters come on. So I got myself a little electronic heat or temperature controller. This one is a kind of a cheap little thing from Eaton Bird. I think it was like $36. And I'll explain it to you in a few minutes why I might should have popped for a little higher, more expensive one. But this worked really well on my system for about almost a year. You can set it to where, and I don't think it's the fault of the Inkbird controller that I had a problem. I'll explain that in a few minutes. But you can calibrate it. Find a trusted heater. You can calibrate it. I had to calibrate mine to it was about 2 degrees off when out of the box. I calibrated it, set it up for 96 degrees, and then hooked 4 300 watt heaters up to it. And because I knew if any of my heaters got left on too long, just one of them anyway, then it couldn't overheat my tank. But I set all my tank heaters to 90 degrees. Okay, set my Inkbird controller to 87 or 86 degrees, I'm sorry. And I set it to come on whenever it dropped down to the temperature to 85 degrees. So anytime my tank got down to 85 degrees, all 4 heaters would come on and run until it got back up to 96 degrees. And it worked really well for about a year. Then I had a power failure. I had a power failure where we lost all power in my house for about 7 or 8 hours. The same day that my power was restored, I was checking the temperature, I was actually doing a water change in my tank, and I noticed that the water was a little cool. Put a thermometer on it, and it was about 82, 83 degrees, but everything had been off for my power had failed for almost 8 hours, so I really wasn't that worried about it. I made sure my controller was calibrated properly, all of that, and when I was satisfied everything was working properly, I went on about my business for the day. Anyway, 2 days later, I was again doing a water change. I do water changes about every other day, every 2 days, and I noticed the water was a little cool. So I pulled out my thermometer, looked at the temperature. It was about 82 degrees, well below the 85 threshold. So thought, well, maybe I didn't calibrate it correctly. So, because my controller was reading that I was at, was it 82? I think it was, my controller was saying my temperature was like 88 degrees or 87 degrees. So it wasn't turning itself on. So I recalibrated it again. And then later, about 4 hours later, I checked it and everything seemed to be running right. 8 hours later, checked it, seemed everything running right. The next day, checked it, everything seemed to be back. So I thought, great, problem solved. Well, the very next day, I come and check my tank again, and it's temperature's low again, about 82 degrees. So I knew I had a problem. So, and at this time, my Inkbird controller said the temperature was 102 degrees in my tanks. And I checked my temperature and it was about 82 degrees. I knew I had a problem because my room itself is about, I don't know, 80, 82 degrees. It is a fish room. I've got a sump for my saltwater tank plus the 150 gallons in here. It gets warm in here. I've got extra heating piped in here. I've got no vents. So the temperature stays pretty warm in here. So I don't have to worry about getting it really too cold, but it was still irritating that it wasn't set at the temperature I like. So pulled it off, started doing other testing. Now it just day-to-day room temperature, this thing's about 30 degrees off and it won't recalibrate. I mean, I can calibrate it within a few hours, it's back to off again. So this thing I think got toasted out by a power surge or something that happened when I had a power failure the other day. But I don't think it's this thing's fault. Now, because I'm going to go right back to the same kind of situation. I may not use this same controller. I may buy a little more expensive controller because this controller is only, you can only control the degrees by 1 degree. And they make one that's like maybe $50 or something like that that you can control by ½ degree. So I may buy one of those. I'm not going to write off the company or the product yet unless I have another failure on one. Then we're going to probably look at a totally different company altogether. But as opposed to a Neptune Apex or something like that, I think it $800 versus someplace around 50 or 60 bucks, I think is probably a fairly good trade-off as long as it works and it works correctly. And it had worked flawlessly all the way to the point that I had a power outage and the power kind of came on a little bit, fluctuated, and it went off, then came on and went off. I think it's just bad power and it just took the controller out. So I think I'm going to get another Inkbird, maybe spend a little bit more and get a little nicer one, and then maybe put an extra surge protector on it or something like that. But the reason I use that electronic controller, because now I've got an electronic controller controlling a mechanical heater. The likelihood of an electronic failure and a mechanical failure is pretty low. Even though I suffered an electronic failure with a power outage, my mechanical part of the heater was just fine. In fact, I had temporarily set up all 4 of my heaters. I had them all 4 set at 90 degrees. So I had to reset those. I reset one of them for 87 degrees. I'll explain that in a second. 87 degrees. I set one at 85 degrees. And then I set 2 at like 84 degrees. And the reason I did that is because I'll have one heater that runs almost all the time. Now I mentioned earlier that sometimes heaters they're not going to come on. If you have it set it at 96 degrees, it's not going to come on at 96. It's probably going to come on, or it's not going to turn off at 96. It's probably going to go a little over to like 97, 97 and a half or something like that. And then it'll turn off and it won't turn back on again until it's probably about 95-ish, something like that. So I set my heater a little hard. I wanted my target temperature to be 96. I set it for 97. Because I know it won't come on until it's about 95 or so, and it's probably going to heat my tank up to about 98 degrees, which is fine because right now in my racks I don't have any fish in my top rack. I just have them in my bottom rack, and that's it. So, or bottom part of my rack. So by the time it gets to the bottom part, it's going to be right at 97 degrees. So in doing that, and then I have the other one set lower because, let's say if I have a failure on one, the other ones are going to keep them from going off. And if I have a failure on any one of these and they get stuck in the on position, I already know that one 300 watt heater is not going to overheat my tank. So I got 4 different heaters. One heater set at 90 at a higher amount, and one set couple of degrees less than that, and then another set of them set a couple of degrees even less than that, so that I've got one heater running almost, not all the time, but quite a bit of the time. I've got one heater that runs infrequently, and I've got two heaters that hardly ever come on. Do that because if my top heater that's set at 75 degrees fails and won't come on, then I've got three other heaters to catch my temperature before it drops too low. If I have a second failure in a heater, I've got two other heaters that are still there to catch it before it gets catastrophically low, because sometimes my room will drop down to about 75 degrees in here, and if it does that, then I know my tank's going to drop down about 75 or 76 or so, and that's going to be really too cold for these fish. Won't kill them, but it won't do them any good either. So I've got four heaters all set at, two of them set at a lower range, one set a little higher, and then one set at the little higher range that my target is, in hopes of keeping average temperatures a little tighter until I get another electronic controller. Now, I've used that heating configuration for years and years, and it's always worked well for me, because I've got one heater that after about a year or so, and that's another deal, I don't keep a well-used heater more than about a year. These things are pretty cheap. What I'll do is I'll take my top heater that's working almost all the time, I'll take it and throw it away, and I'll move my second range heater up, and then I'll create another second range heater. And then every couple of years, my two heaters that never come on, I'll make those at the end of 2 years, they will be my top range heaters. By doing that, I always got a fresh heater running all the time. And again, these heaters are fairly cheap. Now, I don't just throw them away. Whenever I retire a heater, I use it for heating my different water cans, water buckets, stuff like that, for water that I'm aging and things. Or I'll use it for, I've used one to heat up water for a plant station that we had. Stuff that's not mission critical. But I do like to run a heater that's well used all the time for just about a year. I think the lifetime on these things are a lot longer than a year. I've had some heaters that I've had for like 9 or 10 or 12 years that I'm not still using on fish tanks, obviously, but I use them in other places and they still work fine. So I really think I'm being overly cautious on that. Now, to address the other way I've set up my heaters, I've got a 75-gallon tank to where I have one Eheim 150 on it, and I know for a fact that won't overheat my 75 along with my sump to a catastrophic level, because again, I set it up, I run it solid for 2 weeks, and I know it won't run by itself the temperature to a high of a manner. In fact, it runs also about 90 degrees, so I'm thinking whether you got 150 gallons or 95 or 100 gallons, it's probably only going to heat it up to about 90 some odd degrees at the high setting. On that tank, I have one Eheim heater. I do not have an electronic control on that, but then I also have an inline heater from Hydra, and it's got an electronic thermostat in it. And what I do on my Eheim is I have it set up for about 85 degrees, and then the last 2 degrees to get it to 87, I use my electronic Hydra. And in that situation's worked well. I've got 2 different heating elements, 2 different types of heaters on that. One electronic and one computerized, and that's worked really well for me. I just wanted to share this because I have had a failure very recently with an electronic heater controller running controlling mechanical heaters, and just because I mean my tanks were off and my temperature in my room was high, it helped save me. But I really believe that is probably the safest configuration to run heaters. I'm going to keep running it that way. But just some different ideas on how to keep your safety level of your fish higher is use 2 different kind of controllers, whether it's mechanical, one's mechanical and one's electronic. Because there's a lot of heaters out there, I know that a lot of them are electronic temperature controllers, and then an interface that interfaces back with you. And again, they may be great heaters, but you got one point of failure. You got a little computer chip in there that if it catches a too strong a surge or something like that, it can be knocked out, and then you're left without a heater. Or worst case, it can get knocked on, and you got a heater, an over-controlled heater. Because I know a lot of people out there, they know that they need a 200 watt heater, but instead of buying a 200 watt heater, they buy a 300 watt heater, figuring it's going to run less, it's going to save them money. But the problem is your 300 watt heater may be able to overheat your tank. So always, whatever heater you do decide to use, without any fish in your tank, if it's possible, without any fish in your tank, test it. Turn it on, high setting and go, let it go several days in a row. I think about 2 weeks is a great spectrum, because during that time you're going to catch a situation where maybe your temperatures drop a little lower, maybe your room temperature is a little higher. If you have a higher room temperature, maybe your heater can overheat your tank. So test it for as long as period of time as you can. A lot of people tell you to test it for 24 to 48 hours. I just try to test it for as long as I think 2 weeks is plenty long, probably too long, but you're going to run into any situation you can, or you're going to have over a 2 week period, probably environmentally anyway. Obviously you can't do it for a whole year or something like that, where you're going to run into all kind of environmental differences, but 2 weeks is probably good enough. But use two different kind of controllers, electronic and mechanical. DHEIM heater, I'm sorry, it's the only heater I know of that's got a mechanical temperature controller in it. But that's why I use these along with a digital controller. But any way you can mitigate safety or make it safer for your fish, it's always better. I've had real good luck also with the old heaters from, I believe they're Marine. There was stealth heaters. They're like carbon fiber heaters or something like that. You could bang them on the bricks and stuff like that, and it'd still work. They quit making them, but I think Aquarium is brought those back, and they're making them in the same factory. I believe they were made in Italy. Those are good heaters. And I know Cobalt makes good heaters, but again, if you have a Cobalt heater or something like that, you might look at getting two heaters, and put them in different places in your tank. If you put them in your tank, or put them in different places in your sump, if you put them in your sump, in order to make sure that if you have one heater that fails, you're not just out of luck. And maybe get a temperature thermometer with an alarm on it, so it can tell you if your tank is getting overheated. Might be able to save some fish that way. Again, I had a problem because I had two different ways of controlling my heater. It saved me from having any kind of serious catastrophic issues. But and I think it's a great way to save some fish, save some lives on this. If you have any questions or anything, feel free to leave me messages. Please message in the bottom. Tell me if you hated the video, like the video. I'm going to make some more videos in a very short future here. Probably go over maybe thermometers, stuff like that. Different things to help you control your tanks. Again, have a great day. This is Sam Hansen with Discus of the Southwest, and enjoy discus keeping.